Hello, everybody. You are watching Out of Order. My name is Anthony Buono.
My name is Ben Mayer.
And today we're going to be talking about the Biden administration taking new economic measures against China. He is increasing tariffs sometimes fourfold to combat Chinese overcrowding of certain industries.
This is kind of crazy. Yeah.
Listen, when Trump was president, I was not for tariffs. When Biden's president, I'm not for a lot of these tariffs. I just don't.
Hey, your consistency is admirable.
Listen, one of them I think I agree with.
Okay.
Three of them I don't.
Yeah.
I think we're on the same page there, but we'll see.
We will see.
I just think it's so interesting. First, I want to come at it from a meta level before we go into the deeper details of it.
Okay.
I see a lot of people who are now praising Biden for doing the things of taking on China. But then we can pull up old tweets that they had of criticizing Trump, or even Biden himself being like, hey, Trump, Econ 101, tariffs are a tax on the American consumer. And now he's coming at and putting on tariffs, and he's like, I'm fighting for the American industry. And you're like, dude, I can literally defeat your own argument with your own tweet from 4 years ago.
Hooliganism. Hooliganism.
So what are the tariff changes? Okay, let's start. So Chinese electric vehicles are seeing a tariff increase from 25% to 100%. EV batteries are going from 7.5% to 25%. Solar cells are going from 25% to 50%, and steel and aluminum 0 to 75%, all the way up to 25%.
Yeah.
Let's start with the one that I disagree the strongest, okay?
Okay.
Let's start with the steel and aluminum.
So we had talked about this
Yes.
on a recent episode.
I cannot think of a worse economic policy than restricting your supply of an input good. You need steel to produce so many other things. Right now in the US, we are dealing with a housing affordability crisis.
Yep.
And what do we need to do? We need to build. You need steel to build.
Yeah.
And so it's frustrating that we're going to be artificially limiting access to that resource.
Yeah.
For what I think is just the most blatant, pure populism you can imagine.
I agree. What do you think about kind of the supply chain security angle of it? Of like, you're worried that China will choke this resource off.
Yeah.
They do have not complete dominance over the steel market,
but
they are the biggest producer.
Yes.
Is there a better way than placing significant tariffs on steel and aluminum that we could make sure that we're still sourcing from Japan, we're still sourcing from Cleveland Cliffs in the U.S.?
Right.
Do you think so?
I think if you, I would have preferred the U.S. to have its own industrial policy and funnel money into their own steel plants.
Okay.
So that they could have industries that may be able to compete with China.
Okay.
I don't know if at the end of the day that does the same thing economically. I don't know.
Okay.
But I don't think so. I don't think so, because there's an interim period here where we don't currently have the capacity in the U.S. And so those people who are using steel to create and build need to pay this higher tax to do so, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because a few of the tariffs are happening in 2024, a few are happening in 25, a few are happening in 26.
Yeah.
This steel and aluminum tariff is happening in 2024. And that's curious to me because for the higher value add ones like the tariff on EVs, for example, and even semiconductors, there is more of an established supply chain. And there's also like there are a lot of plants making EVs already in the US, right?
Yeah, so we just passed the CHIPS Act.
Yeah.
So we're giving ourselves 2 years so we can make our own semiconductors, so we don't need to buy them from China anymore.
Yes.
And then we'll put the tariff on.
Yes,
right?
exactly. Well, semiconductors is 25.
25.
But
okay.
EVs is 24. Batteries, battery components, and parts is 26.
Got it.
So
okay.
I don't know, but with aluminum and steel, maybe it's just because ramp up is going to be, it can be faster with aluminum and steel because it's basically you mine them and you process them.
Possibly. What's frustrating is one of the benefits of doing tariffs is foreign companies instead want to invest in the U.S. because they want to avoid that tariff. So what happens?
Yeah.
Nippon Steel comes out and they want to buy U.S. steel.
Yeah.
But then when and Nippon Steel is a Japanese company that wants to buy a U.S. steel company, and they want to then create their steel in the United States to avoid any tariffs from abroad, right? Or that's the goal, at least. Now the Biden administration stops that purchasing. So it's almost like you're not getting any of the benefits that even may come with a tariff. The only benefit I could think of doing tariffs is a foreign company building up shop in the U.S. to avoid them.
I mean,
or a local national
American
company builds it up themselves.
yes, that's what Biden wants.
Right.
Yes.
But why? That's the answer. We've muddled over this question for a while.
I think the politics cannot be decoupled from the politics.
No, it can't.
Right? You just look better right now being tough on China. And I think one angle of this to talk about that's related to the politics is how effective are bilateral tariffs really? If you're really worried about the steel and aluminum production in America, you really want to put a tariff on steel and aluminum coming from anywhere that's not the U.S.
Right.
It doesn't really do much to put it just on China because that ends up just coming from other countries. There are still other places that will make steel less expensively, maybe even at a higher quality than they do in the U.S.
Right. So it might not even be the case that new things open up in the U.S. It's more likely that things open up in Vietnam.
Yes.
Right. So it's really not, it's almost not like an American industrial policy to do the tariffs. It's more like an anti-China industrial policy.
Exactly. It is kind of like we're punishing you for your overcapacity. We're punishing you for your attempt to wage economic warfare with these tariffs.
I will also say that China's steel industry does break a lot of international rules and laws and ways of the road. There's no doubt about that.
As far as subsidization?
Yeah, the subsidization of the steel industry is massive. We'll talk about that with the EVs too, because it's a massive. Let's switch over to that.
Okay.
So let's talk about the EVs.
Yeah.
This is one that I'm more sympathetic to the Biden administration on.
Explain that to me.
So I've always said when I say I'm anti-tariffs on the show is I'm against tariffs for input goods.
Yep.
I'm not really against tariffs on principle at the end finished product level.
Mm-hmm.
So why do I think I'm okay with this? Because the Biden administration just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and it has America subsidizing American-made green energy products and technological inputs, and obviously EVs, right? We have a lot of tax credits for electric vehicle consumption. If you're, a taxpayer and you buy an EV, you get money back at your tax return time.
Yep.
So only if it's an American-made car,
Yes.
right? So if too many of the products, if 50% of the value of the battery components are produced outside of North America, you don't get access to that credit. So that's one reason why I think it makes sense.
Just because it fits in that ideology, basically, of build here.
It fits in the ideology of build here. Second is, it's not. I think it's bad for China to have economic success based off of their
subsidies.
No, well, yes, but it's based off the strategy of their subsidization more than anything. China is just on a flat-out mission to capture the international electric vehicle market, right?
Yes.
And so they're subsidizing their EV companies hardcore, and they're doing it to such a degree that these companies don't actually have to operate with a profit.
That's true.
And since so what's happening is these EV companies can dump their cars abroad at any price, whether they're making their money back or not, below cost, it doesn't matter. Then the national government is going to make them whole on the back end.
Yes.
So there's really no way for any person to compete, or any company to compete with these international cars from China, unless another nation goes full out and does the same thing.
It's just a hard argument to make because then, by the logic you're using, no subsidies are okay.
Not by that logic.
Or is it just like a certain extremity? Do you think there's an ambiguous or arbitrary line that's too much subsidy or not enough? Because that's kind of that's what I hear you saying is like it's not okay that China is competing in the international market this way because they're not really competing on fair ground in the international market since they're getting subsidies.
Right.
But that's exactly what we're trying to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, we're not trying to do it by going out into the international market. That's not our express intent.
Right. And so that's actually a really good point because the way the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits operate, they're all from the demand-driven side. It happens at the point of consumption where the consumer gets money back.
Okay.
And so in this case, that's not what's happening. It's the producer getting the money up front. And so they can make their money outside of the country and then, infiltrate. I don't want to say infiltrate because that sounds so violent, but goes into foreign markets.
It's so interesting, though, because the way that China first, I was reading about this today, first built up its EV supply chain and its EV industry was by subsidizing the consumers. And it would actually like it would lure companies to make its EVs and their batteries in China.
Yeah.
Because the only way that it was actually doing the exact same thing that the IRA is. The only way they could access the subsidies from the Chinese government was by having everything made in China.
That's exactly what Biden is doing now.
Yes.
So maybe it's best to look at it not from an ideological right-wrong sense, but as this is what nations do sense.
Exactly.
And that's the real way to look at it.
So I don't think we should have a moral quandary about what China is doing. The question is like, who is this good for, these Biden tariffs, and who is it bad for? It's good for the automakers that exist in the US.
Yes.
Right? It's bad for the consumer, and it's bad for the green transition goals that we have.
I'm not totally convinced that the green energy goals we have and the projections that we have are baked in with the assumption that we were going to take in Chinese EVs.
I'm not sure it will send us completely off track of projections, but it will necessarily slow us down.
It will, since China has the production. But I do think there is something to be said. Like, the United States doesn't want China to control the full market.
Well, I think
no nation's going to want another nation to control the full market.
Well, that's a huge conversation to be had with all of these goods.
Yeah.
These are all looked at as strategic industries now. Right. And it's like, okay, so these are strategic. One of the things that we haven't talked about is PPE equipment is one of the things that, like, basically the story with these tariffs is they're the result of a review that started when the Biden administration took office of the Trump tariffs that were first implemented in 2018 on China. And it's been 3 years in the making. And one of the reasons, one of the things they were looking at is we weren't ready for the pandemic because we procured so much of our PPE from China, our masks and everything else like that. So they're putting tariffs on PPE. Is that a strategic industry? Maybe. It's not strategic as far as we think we can gain massive income or earnings from it by exporting it, right? Or by or geopolitical power from it. But it could be strategic in terms of keeping our country safe, in terms of a national security perspective.
Right.
Are EVs the same way, or are they strategic in any other way?
I mean, they're strategic they're only strategic from an economic growth point of view in my mind.
Yeah, in which case it's almost like that's what we would vilify other countries for doing. That's like what China has been vilifying us for doing.
What we're doing right now, we're fighting fire with fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the problem is we have bigger guns.
Right. So we can argue about who fired the first shot as much as we want, but what's happening now is we're in a firefight with China with this trade war.
Exactly.
But people are saying it doesn't have to turn into a trade war.
It is a trade war.
It already is.
What else
I know.
could this be?
It already is.
Yeah, it's almost like the narrative about the trade war died down because it had been this long that they had been reviewing the tariffs. But this just goes to show, like, Trump started it and Biden has had no problem. When I say finish continue
it.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about how this is actually going to hurt China a lot. I think China is trying to. We're going to talk about this a lot on our Patreon exclusive episode.
Yes.
Yeah. So our Patreon exclusive episode is going to be about the overproduction of China, and they're producing like a lot of things. Is that good or bad? And so what they're doing is they're focusing on exporting their goods out of the country. That's like a lot of their focus. We'll get into it.
Again, we are going to get into it. Whether that is happening, whether it's their focus,
okay,
it is at least a result of these policies.
Okay, it's a result of what they're doing.
Yes.
So if Biden raises all these tariffs,
yeah,
you think the EU won't do the same thing? Oh, they will.
Yes.
The EU is going to do them too. You think General Motors has a lot of sway in the US? Fiat, Volkswagen, they got a lot of sway in Europe.
More.
So they're going to have those tariffs too. And so now is China going to have to subsidize all of their EV companies even more?
Well,
does that then double on to the issues of their debt crisis? It's like a feedback loop. And that's the way I look at it.
I will say China has more cards to play with Europe. We recently had a discussion with about Germany that China and Germany's relationship. And Germany being Europe's biggest economy, Xi Jinping, China's chairman, just took a trip visited Hungary, which is kind of, Orban is kind of a Trojan horse for Xi Jinping as well as Vladimir Putin in the EU.
It's crazy.
They're just going to have a lot less maneuvering space because of the fact that the EU has to work as a bloc, because you have Orban in there.
Yeah.
Other EU economies, including Germany, who are going to be extremely uncomfortable trying to impose any kind of tariffs, start any kind of trade war with China, because there's a lot that China can do and will do to retaliate. The reason, what you know from China, if China is subsidizing all these industries, right? They're going into all this debt. You're wondering, and these companies in China, they're not profitable. They don't have to be profitable. You have to think, they're not getting a ton of economic gain from this. What are they trying to do? All they're trying to do is expand their power on the world stage.
Right.
So they've been waiting for this. They've been waiting for Europe to want to lash back out at them and for them to say, "Nuh-uh, you can't do that."
Yeah. Oh, I wish we actually talked about this one thing, but Macron has gone out and give this super long 2-hour speech that you should listen to, actually. It's really good. And he's just, it's good from, I'm not making a moral judgment of the things he even said. It's just good to watch that leaders say those things. It's very important for you to know what's happening. And he's, lambasting the other European leaders, saying we need to get in order. We need to become one.
Yeah.
We need a European-wide industrial policy the way U.S. and China does. Like we need to be able to, we need to completely orchestrate our militaries together and all that,
Yeah.
And it's really interesting with all that. But
it is.
So that's the EV tariffs. Now, EVs, solar cells, and semiconductors. EV batteries, semiconductors, solar cells. I put them all in one bucket. I feel like they're fairly similar things. Do you agree?
They all fit together. I think semiconductors might be a little bit different. But as far as like EV batteries and solar cells are they're the kind of the railroads of the green energy future that we're looking to have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the U.S. is subsidizing these industries too. Okay. China currently produces 80% of the world's solar panels and solar cells.
Yeah. China dominates solar.
As of 2022, so this is old data, but it's the newest I could find, the U.S. produces 2% of the global solar panels and solar cells. We have a lot of catching up to do. The Inflation Reduction Act does something in regards to that. So they are expanding this investment tax credit, the ITC. It allows taxpayers to deduct 30% of the cost of their solar energy systems from the federal tax bill. It actually includes an additional 10% credit if the solar project meets certain domestic content requirements. So, you're almost getting a 50% reduction for US-made solar panels on your roof.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, and I think the reason they only made that 10% for domestic is because we do only control 2% of the production. Right.
Because that's actually one of the things I was looking at, and it made me nervous. One of the things that I don't like about this is going to slow our green energy transition.
Exactly.
This is going to slow it.
Exactly.
Because 80% of it comes from China, and we don't have a base in the U.S. to really start out from or expand. It's so small.
Yeah. That's
going to slow us down. Whether or not it impacts the transitional timeline, that's just a story that time will tell.
Yeah.
We'll find out. But as a climate hawk, I'm not really comfortable with that.
Exactly. Yeah. And becoming more expensive, slowing us down, they're kind of the same thing when you're existing in a capitalist market. So thanks for watching this episode of Out of Order.
Love it that you made it this far.
This week on Patreon, we've got an update in the Montana Senate race with John Tester. We've got the U.S. and the Taiwan navies doing joint exercises, and the Biden administration has revoked a license to sell semiconductors to Chinese company Huawei.
In addition to that, we have our deep dive this week on Chinese overproduction. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a threat to global markets or a positive? Well, find out on our Friday video.